Chapter 11 of the Exploits of Elaine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Exploits of Elaine by Arthur B. Reeve. Chapter 11. The Hour of Three. With the ominous forefinger of his clutching hand extended, the master criminal emphasized his instructions to his minions. Perry Bennett, her lawyer, is in favour again with Elaine Dodge, he was saying. She and Kennedy are on the outs even yet, but they may become reconciled. Then she'll have that fella on our trail again. Before that happens, we must get her, see? It was in the latest headquarters to which Craig had chased the criminal, in one of the toughest parts of the old Greenwich village, on the west side of New York, not far from the river front. They were all seated in a fairly large but dingy old room, in which were several chairs, a rickety table and, against the wall, a roll-top desk on the top of which was a telephone. Several crooks of the gang were sitting about smoking. "Now," went on Clutching Hand, "I want you, Spike, to follow them. See what they do, where they go. It's her birthday. Something's bound to occur that will give you a lead. All you've got to do is to use your head. Get me?" Spike rose, nodded, picked up his hat and coat, and squirmed out on his mission, like the snake that he was. It was, as Clutching Hand had said, Elaine's birthday. She had received many callers and congratulations, innumerable costly and beautiful tokens of remembrance from her countless friends and admirers. In the conservatory of the Dodge house, Elaine, Aunt Josephine, and Susie Martin were sitting discussing not only the happy occasion, but, more, the many strange events of the past few weeks. "Well," cried a familiar voice behind them, "what would a certain blonde young lady accept as a birthday present from her family lawyer?" All three turned in surprise. "Oh, Mr. Bennett," cried Elaine, "how you startled us!" He laughed and repeated his question, adopting the tone that he had once used in the days when he had been more in favour with the pretty heiress, before the advent of Kennedy. Elaine hesitated. She was thinking not so much of his words as of Kennedy. To them all, however, it seemed that she was unable to make up her mind what, in the wealth of her luxury, she would like. Susie Martin had been wondering whether, now that Bennett was here, she were not de trop, and she looked at her wrist watch mechanically. As she did so, an idea occurred to her. "Why not one of these?" she cried impulsively, indicating the watch. "Father has some beauties at the shop." "Oh, good!" exclaimed Elaine. "How sweet!" She welcomed the suggestion, for she had been thinking that perhaps Bennett might be hinting too seriously at a solitaire. "So that strikes your fancy?" he asked. "Then let's all go to the shop. Miss Martin will personally conduct the tour, and we shall have our pick of the finest stock." A moment later the three young people went out and were quickly whirled off down the avenue in the Dodgetown car. It was too gay a party to notice a sinister figure following them in a cab, but as they entered the fashionable jewelry shop, Spike, who had alighted, walked slowly down the street. Chatting with animation, the three moved over to the watch counter, while the crook, with a determination not to risk missing anything, entered the shop door too. "Mr. Thomas," asked Susie as her father's clerk bowed to them, "please show Miss Dodge the wrist watches father was telling about." With another deferential bow, the clerk hastened to display a case of watches, and they bent over them. As each new watch was pointed out, Elaine was delighted. Unobserved, the crook walked over near enough to hear what was going on. At last, with much banter and yet care, Elaine selected one that was indeed a beauty and was about to snap it on her dainty wrist when the clerk interrupted. "I beg pardon," he suggested, "but I'd advise you to leave it to be regulated, if you please." "Yes, indeed," chimed in Susie. "Father always advises that." Reluctantly, Elaine handed it over to the clerk. "Oh, thank you ever so much, Mr. Bennett," she said as he unobtrusively paid for the watch and gave the address to which it was to be sent when ready. A moment later they went out and entered the car again. As they did so, Spike, who had been looking various things in the next case over as if undecided, came up to the watch counter. "I'm making a present," he remarked confidentially to the clerk. "How about those bracelet watches?" The clerk pulled out some of the cheaper ones. "No," he said thoughtfully, pointing out a tray in the showcase. "Something like those." He ended by picking out one identically like that which Elaine had selected, and started to pay for it. "Better have it regulated," repeated the clerk. "No," he objected hastily, shaking his head and paying the money quickly. "It's a present and I want it tonight." He took the watch and left the store hurriedly. In the laboratory, Kennedy was working over an oblong oak box, perhaps 18 inches in length and half as high. In the box I could see, besides other apparatus, 2 good-sized spools of fine wire. "What's all that?" I asked inquisitively. "Another of the new instruments that scientific detectives use," he responded, scarcely looking up. "A little magnetic wizard, the telegraphone." "Which is?" I prompted. "Something we detectives might use to take down and can telephone and other conversations. When it is attached properly to a telephone, it records everything that is said over the wire." "How does it work?" I asked, much mystified. "Well, it is based on an entirely new principle, in every way different from the phonograph," he explained. "As you can see, there are no discs or cylinders, but these spools of extremely fine steel wire. The record is not made mechanically on a cylinder, but electromagnetically on this wire." "How?" I asked, almost incredulously. "To put it briefly," he went on, "small portions of magnetism, as it were, are imparted to fractions of the steel wire as it passes between 2 carbon electric magnets. Each impression represents a sound wave. There is no apparent difference in the wire, yet each particle of steel undergoes an electromagnetic transformation by which the sound is indelibly imprinted on it." "Then you scrap the wire, just as you shave records to use it over again," I suggested. "No," he replied. "You pass a magnet over it and the magnet automatically erases the record. Rust has no effect. The record lasts as long as steel lasts." Craig continued to tinker tantalizingly with the machine, which had been invented by a Dane, Valdemar Poulsen. He had scarcely finished testing out the telegraphone when the laboratory door opened and a clean-cut young man entered. Kennedy, I knew, had found that the routine work of the Clutching Hand case was beyond his limited time and had retained this young man, Raymond Chase, to attend to that. Chase was a young detective whom Craig had employed on shadowing jobs and as a stool pigeon on other cases, and we had all the confidence in the world in him. Just now what worried Craig was the situation with Elaine, and I fancied that he had given Chase some commission in connection with that. "I've got it, Mr. Kennedy," greeted Chase, with quiet modesty. "Good," responded Craig heartily. "I knew you would." "Got what?" I asked a moment later. Kennedy nodded for Chase to answer. "I've located the new residence of Flirty Florrie," he replied. I saw what Kennedy was after at once. Flirty Florrie and Dan, the Dude, had caused the quarrel between himself and Elaine. Dan the Dude was dead, but Flirty Florrie might be forced to explain it. "That's fine," he added exultingly. "Now, I'll clear that thing up." He took a hasty step to the telephone, put his hand on the receiver, and was about to take it off the hook. Then he paused, and I saw his face working. The wound Elaine had given his feelings was deep. It had not yet quite healed. Finally his pride, for Kennedy's was a highly sensitive nature, got the better of him. "No," he said, half to himself. "Not yet." Elaine had returned home. Alone, her thoughts naturally went back to what had happened recently to interrupt a friendship which had been the sweetest in her life. "There must be some mistake," she murmured pensively to herself, thinking of the photograph Flirty had given her. "Oh, why did I send him away? Why didn't I believe him?" Then she thought of what had happened, of how she had been seized by Dan the Dude in the deserted house, of how the noxious gas had overcome her. They had told her of how Craig had risked his life to save her, how she had been brought home, still only half alive, after his almost miraculous work with the new electric machine. There was his picture. She had not taken that away. As she looked at it, a wave of feeling came over her. Mechanically, she put out her hand to the telephone. She was about to take off the receiver when something seemed to stay her hand. She wanted him to come to her. And if either of them had called the other just then, they would have probably crossed wires. Of such stuff are the quarrels of lovers. Craig's eyes fell on the telegraphone, and an idea seemed to occur to him. "Walter, you and Chase bring that thing along," he said a moment later. He paused long enough to take a badge from the drawer of a cabinet and went out. We followed him, lugging the telegraphone. At last we came to the apartment house at which Chase had located the woman. "There it is," he pointed out, as I gave a groan of relief, for the telegraphone was getting like lead. Kennedy nodded and drew from his pocket the badge I had seen him take from the cabinet. "Now, Chase," he directed, "you needn't go in with us. Walter and I can manage this now. But don't get out of touch with me. I shall need you any moment, certainly tomorrow." I saw that the badge read, "Telephone Inspector." "Walter," he smiled, "you're elected my helper." We entered the apartment house hall and found a Negro boy in charge of the switchboard. It took Craig only a moment to convince the boy that he was from the company and that complaints had been made by some anonymous tenant. "You look over that switchboard, Kelly," he winked at me, "while I test out the connections back here. There must be something wrong with the wires or there wouldn't be so many complaints." He had gone back at the switchboard, and the Negro, still unsuspicious, watched without understanding what it was all about. "I don't know," Craig muttered finally for the benefit of the boy, "but I think I'll have to leave that tester after all. Say, if I put it here, You'll have to be careful not to let anyone meddle with it. If you do, there'll be the deuce to pay, see?" Kennedy had already started to fasten the telegraphone to the wires he had selected from the tangle. At last he finished and stood up. "Don't disturb it and don't let anyone else touch it," he ordered. "Better not tell anyone. That's the best way. I'll be back for it tomorrow probably." "Yes, sir," nodded the boy, with a bow, as we went out. We returned to the laboratory, where there seemed to be nothing we could do now except wait for something to happen. Kennedy, however, employed the time by plunging into work, most of the time experimenting with a peculiar little coil to which ran the wires of an ordinary electric bell. Back in the new hangout, the Clutching Hand was laying down the law to his lieutenants and heelers, when Spike at last entered. "Ah," growled the master criminal, covering the fact that he was considerably relieved to see him at last. "Where have you been? I've been off on a little job myself and got back." Spike apologized profusely. He had succeeded so easily that he had thought to take a little time to meet up with an old pal whom he ran across, just out of prison. "Yes, sir," he replied hastily. "Well, I went over to the Dodge house and I saw them finally. Followed them into a jewelry shop. That lawyer bought her a wrist watch, so I bought one just like it. I thought perhaps we could—" "Give it to me," growled Clutching Hand, seizing it the moment Slim displayed it. "And don't butt in, see?" From the capacious desk, the master criminal pulled a set of small drills, vices, and other jeweler's tools and placed them on the table. "All right," he relented. "Now, do you see what I have just thought of? No? This is just the chance. Look at me." The heelers gathered around him, peering curiously at their master as he worked at the bracelet watch. Carefully he plied his hands to the job, regardless of time. "There," he exclaimed at last, holding the watch up where they could all see it. "See?" He pulled out the stem to set the hands and slowly twisted it between his thumb and finger. He turned the hands until they were almost at the point of 3 o'clock. Then he held the watch out where all could see it. They bent closer and strained their eyes at the little second hand ticking away merrily. As the minute hand touched 3, from the back of the case, as if from the casing itself, a little needle, perhaps a quarter of an inch, jumped out. It seemed to come from what looked like merely a small inset in the decorations. "You see what will happen at the hour of 3?" he asked. No one said a word, as he held up a vial which had been drawn from his pocket. On it they could read the label, "Ricinus." "One of the most powerful poisons in the world," he exclaimed. "Enough here to kill a regiment." They fairly gasped and looked at it with horror, exchanging glances. Then they looked at him in awe. There was no wonder that Clutching Hand kept them in line. Once he had a crook in his power. Opening the vial carefully, he dipped in a thin piece of glass and placed a tiny drop in a receptacle back of the needle and on the needle itself. Altogether it savoured on the ancient days of the Borgias with their weird poison rings. Then he dropped the vial back into his pocket, pressed a spring, and the needle went back into its unsuspected hiding place. "I've set my invention to go off at 3 o'clock," he concluded. "Tomorrow forenoon it will have to be delivered early. And I don't believe we shall be troubled any longer by Miss Elaine Dodge," he added venomously. Even the crooks, hardened as they were, could only gasp. Calmly he wrapped up the apparently innocent engine of destruction and handed it to Spike. "See that she gets it in time," he said merely. "I will, sir," answered Spike, taking it gingerly. Flirty Florrie had returned that afternoon late, from some expedition on which she had been sent. Rankling in her heart yet was the death of her lover, Dan the Dude, for although in her sphere of crookdom they are neither married nor given in marriage, still there is a brand of loyalty that higher circles might well copy. Sacred to the memory of the dead, however, she had one desire, revenge. Thus when she arrived home, she went to the telephone to report and called a number, 4494 Greenwich. "Hello, Chief," she repeated. "This is Flirty. Have you done anything yet in the little matter we talked about?" "Say, be careful of names over the wire," came a growl. "You know what I mean." "Yes, the trick will be pulled off at 3 o'clock." "Good," she exclaimed. "Good-bye and thank you." With his well-known caution, Clutching Hand did not even betray names over the telephone if he could help it. Flirty hung up the receiver with satisfaction. The manes of the departed Dan might soon rest in peace. The next day, early in the forenoon, a young man with a small package, carefully done up, came to the Dodge house. "From Martin's, the jewelers, for Miss Dodge," he said to Jennings at the door. Elaine and Aunt Josephine were sitting in the library when Jennings announced him. "Oh, it's my watch!" cried Elaine. "Show him in." Jennings bowed and did so. Spike entered and handed the package to Elaine, who signed her name excitedly and opened it. "Just look, Auntie," she exclaimed. "Isn't it stunning?" "Very pretty," commented Aunt Josephine. Elaine put the watch on her wrist and admired it. "Is it all right?" asked Spike. "Yes, yes," answered Elaine. "You may go." He went out, while Elaine gazed rapturously at the new trinket while it ticked off the minutes. This devilish instrument. Early the same morning Kennedy went around again to the apartment house and, cautious not to be seen by Flirty, recovered the telegraphone. Together we carried it to the laboratory. There he set up a little instrument that looked like a wedge sitting up on end, in the face of which was a dial. Through it he began to run the wire from the spools, and, taking an earpiece, put another on my head over my ears. "You see," he explained, "the principle on which this is based is that a mass of tempered steel may be impressed with and will retain magnetic fluxes varying in density and in sign in adjacent portions of itself, like deposits of magnetic impulse. When the telegraphone is attached to the telephone wire, the currents that affect the receiver also affect the coils of the telegraphone, and the disturbance set up causes a deposit of magnetic impulse on the steel wire. When the wire is again run past these coils, with a receiver such as I have here, in circuit with the coils, a light vibration is set up in the receiver diaphragm, which reproduces the sound of speech." He turned a switch and we listened eagerly. There was no grating and thumping, as he controlled the running off of the wire. We were listening to everything that had been said over the telephone during the time since we left the machine. First came several calls from people with bills, and she put them off most adroitly. Then we heard a call that caused Kennedy to look at me quickly. "Stop the machine and start at that point over again." "That's what I wanted," he said as we listened in. "Give me 4494 Greenwich." Hello? Hello, Chief. This is Flirty. Have you done anything yet in the little matter we talked about? Say, be careful of names over the wire. You know what I mean. Yes, the trick will be pulled off at 3 o'clock. Good. Goodbye and thank you. Goodbye. Kennedy stopped the machine and I looked at him blankly. She called Greenwich 4494 and was told that the trick would be pulled off at 3 o'clock today. He ruminated. What trick? I asked. He shook his head. I don't know. That is what we must find out. I hadn't expected a tip like that. What I wanted was to find out how to get at the Clutching Hand. He paused and considered a minute, then moved to the telephone. There's only one thing to do and that's to follow out my original scheme, he said energetically. Information, please. Where is Greenwich 4494? He asked a moment later. The minutes passed. Thank you, he cried, writing down on a pad an address over on the west side near the river front. Then, turning to me, he explained, Walter, we've got him at last. Craig rose and put on his hat and coat, thrusting a pair of opera glasses into his pocket, in case we should want to observe the place at a distance. I followed him excitedly. The trail was hot. Kennedy and I came at last to the place on the west side where the crooked streets curved off. Instead of keeping on until he came to the place we sought, he turned and quickly slipped behind the shelter of a fence. There was a broken board in the fence and he bent down, gazing through with the opera glasses. Across the lot was the new headquarters, a somewhat dilapidated old-fashioned brick house of several generations back. Through the glass we could see an evil-countenanced crook slinking along. He mounted the steps and rang the bell, turning as he waited. From a small aperture in the doorway looked out another face, equally evil. Under cover the crook made the sign of the Clutching Hand twice and was admitted. "That's the place, all right," whispered Kennedy with satisfaction. He hurried to a telephone booth where he called several numbers. Then we returned to the laboratory, while Kennedy quickly figured out a plan of action. I knew Chase was expected there soon. From the table he picked up the small coil over which I had seen him working and attached it to the bell and some batteries. He replaced it on the table, while I watched curiously. "A selenium cell," he explained. "Only when light falls on it does it become a good conductor of electricity. Then the bell will ring." Just before making the connection, he placed his hat over the cell. Then he lifted the hat. The light fell on it and the bell rang. He replaced the hat and the bell stopped. It was evidently a very peculiar property of the substance selenium. Just then there came a knock at the door. I opened it. "Hello, Chase," greeted Kennedy. "Well, I've found the new headquarters all right, over on the west side." Kennedy picked up the selenium cell and a long coil of fine wire, which he placed in a bag. Then he took another bag already packed and, shifting them between us, we hurried downtown. Near the vacant lot, back of the new headquarters, was an old broken down house. Through the rear of it we entered. I started back in astonishment as we found 8 or 10 policemen already there. Kennedy had ordered them to be ready for a raid and they had dropped in one at a time without attracting attention. "Well, men," he greeted them, "I see you found the place all right. Now, in a little while Jameson will return with 2 wires. Attach them to the bell which I will leave here. When it rings, raid the house. Jameson will lead you to it. Come, Walter," he added, picking up the bags. 10 minutes later, outside the new headquarters, a crouched up figure, carrying a small package, his face hidden under his soft hat and upturned collar, could have been seen slinking along until he came to the steps. He went up and peered through the aperture of the doorway. Then he rang the bell. Twice he raised his hand and clenched it in the now familiar clutch. A crook inside saw it through the aperture and opened the door. The figure entered and almost before the door was shut, tied the masking handkerchief over his face, which hid his identity from even the most trusted lieutenants. The crook bowed to the chief, who, with a growl, as though of recognition, moved down the hall. As he came to the room from which Spike had been sent on his mission, the same group was seated in the thick tobacco smoke. "You fellows clear out," he growled. "I want to be alone." "The old man is peeved," muttered one, outside, as they left. The weird figure gazed about the room to be sure that he was alone. When Craig and I left the police, he had given me most minute instructions, which I was now following out to the letter. "I want you to hide there," he said, indicating a barrel back of the house next to the hangout. "When you see a wire come down from the headquarters, take it and carry it across the lot to the old house. Attach it to the bell, then wait. When it rings, raid the Clutching Hand joint." I waited what seemed to be an interminable time back of the barrel, and it is no joke hiding back of a barrel. Finally, however, I saw a coil of fine wire drop rapidly to the ground from a window somewhere above. I made a dash for it, as though I were trying to rush the trenches, seized my prize, and without looking back to see where it came from, beat a hasty retreat. Around the lot I skirted, until at last I reached the place where the police were waiting. Quickly we fastened the wire to the bell. We waited. Not a sound from the bell. Up in the room in the joint, the hunched up figure stood by the table. He had taken his hat off and placed it carefully on the table, and was now waiting. Suddenly a noise at the door startled him. He listened. Then he backed away from the door and drew a revolver. As the door slowly opened, there entered another figure, hat over his eyes, collar up, a handkerchief over his face, the exact counterpart of the first. For a moment each glared at each other. "Hands up!" shouted the first figure, hoarsely, moving the gun and closing the door with his foot. The newcomer slowly raised his crooked hand over his head as the blue steel revolver gaped menacingly. With a quick movement of the other hand, the first sinister figure removed the handkerchief from his face and straightened up. It was Kennedy. "Come over to the center of the room," ordered Kennedy. Clutching Hand obeyed, eyeing his captor closely. "Now lay your weapons on the table." He tossed down a revolver. The two still faced each other. "Take off that handkerchief." It was a tense moment. Slowly Clutching Hand started to obey. Then he stopped. Kennedy was just about to thunder, "Go on," when the criminal calmly remarked, "You've got me, all right, Kennedy, but in 20 minutes Elaine Dodge will be dead." He said it with a nonchalance that might have deceived anyone less astute than Kennedy. Suddenly there flashed over Craig the words, "The trick will be pulled off at 3 o'clock." There was no fake about that. Kennedy frowned. If he killed Clutching Hand, Elaine would die. If he fought, he must either kill or be killed. If he handed Clutching Hand over, all he had to do was to keep quiet. He looked at his watch. It was 25 minutes of 3. What a situation! He had caught a prisoner he dared not molest yet. "What do you mean? Tell me," demanded Kennedy with forced calm. "Yesterday Mr. Bennett bought a wrist watch for Elaine," the Clutching Hand said quietly. "They left it to be regulated. One of my men bought one just like it. Mine was delivered to her today." "A likely story," doubted Kennedy. For answer, the Clutching Hand pointed to the telephone. Kennedy reached for it. "One thing," interrupted the Clutching Hand. "You are a man of honor." "Yes, yes, go on." "If I tell you what to do, you must promise to give me a fighting chance." "Yes, yes." "Call up Aunt Josephine, then. Do just as I say." Covering Clutching Hand, Kennedy called a number. "This is Mr. Kennedy, Mrs. Dodge. Did Elaine receive a present of a wrist watch from Mr. Bennett?" "Yes," she replied, "for her birthday. It came this forenoon." Kennedy hung up the receiver and faced Clutching Hand, puzzled as the latter said, "Call up Martin, the jeweler." Again Kennedy obeyed. "Has the watch purchased for Miss Elaine Dodge been delivered?" he asked the clerk. "No," came back the reply. "The watch Mr. Bennett bought is still here, being regulated." Kennedy hung up the receiver. He was stunned. "The watch will cause her death at 3 o'clock," said the Clutching Hand. "Swear to leave here without discovering my identity, and I will tell you how. You can save her." A moment Kennedy thought. He was a quandary. "No," he shouted, seizing the telephone. Before Kennedy could move, Clutching Hand had pulled the telephone wires with almost superhuman strength from the junction box. "In that watch," he hissed, "I have set a poison needle in a spring that will be released and will plunge it into her arm at exactly 3 o'clock. On the needle is ricinous." Craig advanced furious. As he did so, Clutching Hand pointed calmly to the clock. It was 20 minutes of 3. With a mental struggle, Kennedy controlled his loathing of the creature before him. "All right, but you'll hear from me sooner than you suspect," he shouted, starting for the door. Then he came back and lifted his hat, hiding as much as possible the selenium cell, letting the light fall on it. "Only Elaine's life has saved you." With a last threat, he dashed out. He hailed a cab, returning from some steamship wharves not far away. "Quick," he ordered, giving the Dodge address on Fifth Avenue. Minute after minute, the police and I waited. Was anything wrong? Where was Craig? Just then a tremor grew into a tinkle. Then came the strong burr of the bell. Kennedy needed us. With a shout of encouragement to the men, I dashed out and over to the old house. Meanwhile, Clutching Hand himself had approached the table to recover his weapon and had noticed the queer little selenium cell. He picked it up and for the first time saw the wire leading out. "The deuce!" he cried. "He's planned to get me anyhow." Clutching Hand rushed to the door, then stopped short. Outside he could hear the police and myself. We had shot the lock on the outside and were already inside. Clutching Hand slammed shut his door and pulled down over it a heavy wooden bar. A few steps took him to the window. There were police in the backyard too. He was surrounded. But he did not hurry. He knew what to do with every second. At the desk he paused and took out a piece of cardboard. Then with a heavy black marking pencil, he calmly printed on it, while we battered at the barricaded door a few short feet away. He laid the sign on the desk, then on another piece of cardboard, drew crudely a hand with the index finger, pointing. This he placed on a chair, indicating the desk. Just as the swaying and bulging door gave way, Clutching Hand gave the desk a pull. It opened up his getaway. He closed it with a sardonic smile in our direction, just before the door crashed in. We looked about. There was not a soul in the room, nothing but the selenium cell, the chairs, the desk. "Look!" I cried, catching sight of the index finger, and going over to the desk. We rolled back the top. There on the flat top was a sign. "Dear blockheads, Kennedy and I couldn't wait. Yours as ever." Then came that mysterious sign of the Clutching Hand. We hunted over the rooms, but could find nothing that showed a clue. Where was Clutching Hand? Where was Kennedy? In the next house Clutching Hand had literally come out of an upright piano into the room corresponding to that he had left. Hastily he threw off his handkerchief, slouch hat, old coat and trousers. A neat striped pair of trousers replaced the old, frayed and baggy pair. A new shirt, then a sporty vest and a frock coat followed. As he put the finishing touches on, he looked for all the world like a bewhiskered foreigner. With a silk hat and stick, he surveyed himself, straightening his tie. At the door of the new headquarters, a few seconds later, I stood with the police. "Not a sign of him anywhere," growled one of the officers. Nor was there. Down the street, we could see only a straight, well-dressed, distinguished-looking man, who had evidently walked down to the docks to see a friend off, perhaps. Elaine was sitting in the library reading when Aunt Josephine turned to her. "What time is it, dear?" she asked. Elaine glanced at her pretty, new trinket. "Nearly 3, Auntie. A couple of minutes," she said. Just then there came the sound of feet running madly down the hallway. They jumped up, startled. Kennedy, his coat flying and hat jammed over his eyes, had almost bowled over poor Jennings in his mad race down the hall. "Well," demanded Elaine haughtily, "what's—" Before she knew what was going on, Craig hurried up to her and literally ripped the watch off her wrist, breaking the beautiful bracelet. He held it up gingerly. Elaine was speechless. Was this Kennedy? Was he possessed by such an inordinate jealousy of Bennett? As he held the watch up, the second hand ticked around and the minute hand passed the meridian of the hour. A viciously sharp little needle gleamed out, then sprang back into the filigree work again. "Well," she gasped again, "what's the occasion of this?" Craig gazed at Elaine in silence. Should he defend his rudeness, if she did not understand? She stamped her foot, and repeated the question a third time. "What do you mean, sir, by such conduct?" Slowly he bowed. "I just don't like the kind of birthday presents you receive," he said, turning on his heel. "Good afternoon." Chapter 11